Welcome to the Advanced Customization module. This module includes information on leveraging APIs, as well as working with advanced formulas. In this lesson, you will be introduced to QuickBase API basics. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to apply QuickBase-specific API basics to previous API knowledge, construct basic API calls, and identify best practices for utilizing the QuickBase API. QSPs can apply API knowledge to the building of an application and open the application up beyond native QuickBase. For example, moving data in and out automatically from other systems. Learning APIs will allow QSPs to manipulate data with API calls, build out complex business process and workflows. In this section, you will be introduced to basic API knowledge as it pertains to QuickBase. First, the QuickBase API is XML over HTTP and supports both GET and POST requests. While the API calls are usually made by external scripts, you can type in the API calls as a GET request in the browser to quickly learn and debug the responses. All calls will result in an XML response, except for API GET record as HTML, which will result in HTML. Here's an example of an XML response from an API add record call. Most actions you perform inside of a QuickBase application can be performed using an API call. There are some exceptions. For example, a relationship cannot be created through the API. By utilizing API calls, you can help automate process and workflow in customers' applications. The following are a few examples of what is possible. You can create, copy, and delete applications, create, modify, and delete tables and fields, and add, update, delete, and query table records. In this section, we will review a few elements that are required for QuickBase API calls. All QuickBase requests can be divided into three endpoint categories or handlers: main, application, and table. The main endpoints are API calls independent of a specific application. API Authenticate is an example of a main handler call. Application handlers are calls to a specific application. An example of this type of call would be API Clone Database. Table handlers are calls to a specific table. API Add Record is an example of such a call. Application and table handlers look the same. The difference is whether the call being used is application or table specific. In order to successfully complete an external API call, you will need to authenticate your username and password. API Authenticate validates your username and password and returns a ticket that will be used in subsequent API calls. Using API Authenticate is the equivalent of logging into QuickBase. The ticket is returned as a result of API Authenticate is valid for 12 hours by default. If you would like to alter this time limit, you may do so within the API call. Finally, you will need to make this call using secure HTTPS. Otherwise, login information can potentially be seen or used by anyone. Here's an example of the URL request for API Authenticate and the XML response. In addition to the ticket, a cookie is also returned with the name ticket. This is the only API call that returns a ticket cookie. As mentioned previously, you will use this ticket to make API calls going forward. QuickBase has application tokens enabled by default. Application tokens provide an extra layer of security to applications, making it extremely difficult for an unauthorized user to make API calls to your application. With tokens enabled, you will need to supply an application token in order to make API calls. Here's an example of using tokens in an API edit record call. API calls that interact with records that already exist will require the use of the table's key field. By default, the key field in QuickBase will be the record ID, which is an auto-generated sequential number. you will use the parameter RID to reference the record ID in API calls. If you use a field other than the record ID field as the key field, you may be able to replace the RID parameter in many of the API calls with the key parameter. The following API calls support this substitution: API delete record, API edit record, API get record as HTML, API get record info, and API change record owner. Now that we have learned some key requirements for constructing an API call, we will go over a few common API calls and their key parameters. You may have a scenario where you would like to add records to tables within an application through the API. For this, you can use API add record. This call is executed at the table level, so you will need the table DB ID. You will also need the field IDs, or the name of the fields you would like to populate with data. As discussed previously, you need to pass the ticket an application token only if application tokens are enabled. Here's an example of API add record call in URL form. The required parameters are highlighted. API edit record can be used to edit a particular record in a table. This call requires everything that API add record required, with the addition of the record ID or custom key field parameter. API do query allows you to query records from a QuickBase table. This call has many optional parameters or filters which enable you to get the data you are looking for. A few of these parameters include CT for contains, EX is equal to a specific value, and GT for greater than. There are many more that you can find in the online API guide. Field IDs are required when specifying these parameters. In previous calls, you could use field ID and field name interchangeably, but that is not the case with API do query. In addition to the filter parameters, you can also specify which fields you would like to include in the results and how to sort those fields. You can do this by using CList and SList, respectively. Now let's review some best practices for utilizing the QuickBase API. Only execute API Authenticate once. Do not pass the username and password with every call. The ticket that is returned with the API Authenticate call should be saved and used in subsequent calls. Stagger API calls in order to maintain the performance integrity of QuickBase. If you use API import from CSV to add records to a table, separate the data set into manageable chunks. A good rule of thumb is to break up the data if the CSV file is over 10 megabytes. Consume XLM responses and evaluate success or error of the API call, and institute a retry strategy for failed calls. Keep in mind the frequency of which you require the data when querying. If the data is relatively static, cache locally to avoid constant API calls to QuickBase. Schedule process-intensive work during off-peak hours. When using API do query against a table with a large number of fields, refrain from using CList equals A. This parameter will return every field in the table and can cause performance issues. For more information about QuickBase API calls, refer to the API guide located in the Documents table of QSP Central. By having the tools to build out more complex applications, you are now in a position to expand the QuickBase product and deliver an even more valuable experience for your clients. This advanced knowledge will open up more opportunities from a technical perspective and give you even more flexibility to solve your clients' more complex solution needs with QuickBase. This concludes the lesson on leveraging APIs. You should now be able to apply QuickBase-specific API basics to previous API knowledge, construct QuickBase API calls, and identify best practices for utilizing the QuickBase API.